There is a peculiar dance that human beings have been performing for thousands of years, and yet we speak of it as if it were a modern tragedy, a new psychological discovery, a diagnostic curiosity, when in fact it is one of the oldest stories consciousness has ever told itself. The story of the soft one and the hard one, the receptive and the aggressive, the listener and the talker, the one who absorbs and the one who takes. And we make the mistake, you see, of thinking this story belongs to men and women, to personality disorders, to trauma labels, to therapy rooms and court cases, when really it belongs to energy, to polarity, to the way life itself unfolds through contrast. Because everywhere you look in nature, there is this same rhythm, the vine and the tree, the river and the rock, the open field and the predator that crosses it. And when human beings forget that they are part of nature, they become very confused by patterns that are perfectly natural but terribly dangerous when unconscious. And so you find, again and again, people who are emotionally sensitive, inwardly oriented, empathic, porous. People who feel first and think later. People who carry wounds quietly rather than loudly. People who learned early in life that survival meant adapting, soothing, pleasing, understanding, enduring. And these people, quite mysteriously to themselves, find their lives entangled with individuals who are the opposite in posture. Not necessarily evil, not necessarily monstrous, but armored, dominant, extractive, self-referential. Individuals who move through the world not by attuning but by imposing, not by absorbing but by consuming. And when these two meet, something feels fated, electric, inevitable, because the sensitive one feels seen for the first time, or at least feels chosen, and the dominant one feels mirrored, admired, stabilized. And what no one teaches you is that this is not love in the romantic sense at all. It is a structure, a psychological ecosystem, a closed circuit in which each person is unconsciously fulfilling the unfinished business of their past. And the tragedy is not that it happens, but that it repeats, because repetition is the mind's attempt to resolve what it does not yet understand. And so the sensitive one says, it's complicated. Not because it truly is, but because complexity becomes the refuge of confusion, and confusion feels safer than clarity when clarity would require leaving what feels familiar, because chaos you recognize feels safer than peace you don't. And so the sensitive person stays, again and again, in relationships, workplaces, families, systems, where they are drained, minimized, manipulated, subtly erased, not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering has become home. And when someone says, "Why don't you just leave?" they are asking the wrong question entirely, because the real question is, who would you be without this struggle? And that question is terrifying to someone whose identity was forged in adaptation. Because when your sense of self was built around managing the emotions of others, absorbing volatility, translating danger into meaning, then peace feels empty. Silence feels like abandonment, and safety feels strangely boring. And so the mind, being clever, dresses this up as loyalty, as empathy, as depth, as complexity, saying things like, "They're not always like that," or "They had a hard childhood," or "I see their potential," which are all true, and yet entirely beside the point, because understanding someone's wounds does not obligate you to bleed for them. And yet the sensitive person feels that it does, because they learned early that love meant endurance, that closeness required self-erasure, that being needed was the same as being loved. And on the other side of this dance, the dominant, antisocial, narcissistic, predatory type, again, not as a moral judgment, but as an orientation, learned something equally tragic, which is that power brings safety, control brings relief, superiority protects against vulnerability. And so when these two meet, it feels like destiny, when in fact it is mutual misrecognition, each seeing in the other the missing piece of their unfinished self, and what emerges is trauma bonding. Not as a dramatic explosion, but as a quiet glue made of intermittent reward, unpredictability, longing, fear, and hope, because nothing binds the nervous system like uncertainty paired with occasional relief. And this is why the cycle repeats, why the sensitive one leaves and returns, quits and re-enters, promises themselves, never again, and then finds themselves saying the same lines with a different face, because the cycle is not outside them, it is inside, looping like a record stuck on the same groove. And insanity, as they say, is not doing the same thing over and over expecting different results, but doing the same thing over and over while telling yourself a more elaborate story about why this time it will be different. And so the sensitive person intellectualizes, spiritualizes, psychoanalyzes, explains, contextualizes, while their body quietly tightens, their vitality dims, their voice softens into caution. And what no one ever teaches you is that predators, whether in relationships, organizations, or systems, do not hunt strength. They hunt unprotected openness. And openness without boundaries is not virtue. It is vulnerability, mistaken for morality. And so the sensitive person believes they are being good, kind, evolved, while slowly disappearing. And the tragedy is that society rewards this disappearance, calling it professionalism, loyalty, resilience, emotional intelligence, while quietly benefiting from the labor, creativity, and emotional regulation of these individuals. And so the pattern extends beyond romance into work, into institutions, into cultures, where those who internalize pain keep the system running, while those who externalize pain rise to the top. And then we are shocked to discover that the world feels increasingly cruel, unstable, and exploitative, as if this were not the inevitable outcome of rewarding predatory orientation and punishing sensitivity. And yet the solution is not to harden the sensitive, nor to demonize the dominant, but to awaken consciousness to the pattern itself, because the moment you see the dance, you are no longer fully possessed by it. And this is where Alan Watts would smile gently and say, "You see, the problem is not that you are too kind, but that you don't know who you are being kind to. And the problem is not that the other is selfish, but that they do not know they are afraid, and fear dressed as confidence is one of the most convincing costumes in the human theater. And so the invitation is not to blame, not to diagnose, not to pathologize, but to wake up, to notice the sensation in your body when you say, 'It's complicated.' Because complexity is often the mind's way of avoiding the simplicity of truth, which is usually something like, 'This hurts,' or 'This is not mutual,' or 'I am abandoning myself.' And these truths feel unbearable at first, because they require grief, and grief is the price of liberation, because you must mourn not only the other, but the fantasy of who you thought you could be together, and more painfully, the identity you built around being the one who stays, the one who understands, the one who endures. And when you let that go, there is a terrifying moment of groundlessness, where you no longer know who you are without the struggle. And this is where most people turn back, because the ego would rather suffer than dissolve. But if you stay, if you tolerate that emptiness without rushing to fill it with another familiar pain, something extraordinary happens. The nervous system begins to recalibrate. The body learns that calm is not abandonment, that peace is not boredom, that love does not require self-betrayal, and slowly, very slowly, the attraction shifts, not because you became colder, but because you became clearer. And clarity is invisible to predators, because predators rely on confusion. And when confusion leaves, the dance ends, not with drama, but with a quiet loss of interest. And this is perhaps the most radical teaching of all, that freedom often feels anticlimactic, that healing does not arrive as fireworks, but as a subtle absence of tension, a spaciousness where compulsion used to be. And you realize, perhaps for the first time, that what you were calling chemistry was anxiety, what you were calling depth was dysregulation, what you were calling love was familiarity with pain. And this realization does not make you bitter. It makes you humble, because you see that everyone in this dance was trying to survive with the tools they had. And survival is not a moral failing, but it is not the same as living. And so the teaching, if there is one, is not avoid narcissists or stop being sensitive, but rather know yourself. Know the patterns your nervous system mistakes for love. Know the roles your childhood rehearsed so well that you keep performing them on new stages. And when you know this, truly know it, Not as an idea, but as a felt recognition, the spell breaks. Not because the world changes, but because you do. And you stop calling insanity complexity. You stop calling endurance virtue. You stop calling self-betrayal compassion. And in that quiet stopping, life begins again. Not as a battle between prey and predator, but as a dance you finally get to choose whether or not to join. Thank you.